Hi guys, welcome back to another episode of Unfollowing Mum. I hope you've all been having a great week. I think we've just come off the back of half term here, so had a little break with the kids. That was manic, but good fun, good fun. Hope everybody enjoyed it. I have a guest with me today, and I am really excited to talk to her. I have been a follower for a while. I think quite a few of you will recognize her. She has a book out at the moment. It is Sahaj Kohli. Hi, how are you?
I'm good. Thank you for having me. I'm excited to talk to you.
Thank you so much for being here. Can you tell listeners who are perhaps not familiar with you or who maybe follow a little bit of your social media a little bit more about yourself?
Sure, yeah. So I am a practicing therapist, a advice columnist at the Washington Post here in the United States, and I have a Instagram community called Brown Girl Therapy, which is the first and largest mental health community for adult children of immigrants living in the West. All of the work I do really revolves around cultural brokering, so negotiating our different cultural systems, values, norms, expectations in our relationships at work, in our day-to-day life, especially for anyone who identifies as bicultural or multicultural.
Wow, that is absolutely amazing. And I've been following Brown Girl Therapy for a long time. And I think the work that you do there is fantastic because whilst my community is primarily focused on people who have either grown up in dysfunctional family or they have cut contact, obviously I'm a white woman. And it's a very different attitude and a very different cultural lens, I think, to the differences in how we react to these things, in how our communities react to these things, in how our parents react to the social expectation. I think it's really important to have communities where we can share those experiences. What drew you into that work particularly?
Well, my own personal experience. And so I'm the first in my family to be born in the West, first in my family to, marry outside of race, religion, and culture. So I am married myself to an American white man. First in my family to go to therapy, talk about my mental health struggles. And I just feel like even when I wasn't the first to do things, I feel like my whole life was just navigating this tension that now I have language for. It's called bicultural straddling, but constantly trying to adapt between different cultural streams. So I grew up in a very traditional Indian household, but I was socialized in a very Western American environment. And so the values and expectations imposed on me at home were very different from the values and expectations I was being taught and socialized in outside in the world. And so, as a therapist, I know now that at a young age, developmentally, we want to belong, we want to be accepted, we feel a lot of shame around experiences that might induce shame for our cultures or where we come from or what we look like or how our parents talk or the food that we bring to school, whatever it is. And I think those like early memories, those early experiences can teach so many of us to feel shame for our heritage and our ancestry and our roots. And a lot of the work I do is really trying to help people reconnect with where they come from, to accept that being bicultural looks different for everyone, that being culturally enough looks different for everyone. But as you say, a lot of my work with my clients and as a therapist is about helping people in their relationships. And whether it's addressing what is functional for you, what is normal for you, what feels okay to you, and helping people identify the cultural narratives around being in relationships that might not be healthy for you, or wanting to speak up for yourself when you haven't been taught to. And so, as you say, sociocultural context really matters when we think about how we want to show up in our relationships and whether or not we even want to be in these relationships.
And I think it's really difficult picking up on that, whether we want to be in these relationships. Within a lot of cultures, it's not acceptable to step outside of that relationship. In fact, it has much bigger connotations in some cultures than it does in others. It has much more impact on your life, on how you're perceived. And for some, there's a thread that I think goes through. There's always a stigma around stepping away from a parental child relationship as an adult and saying, hey, this that happened when I was younger, when I was a child, this wasn't acceptable. And the way that you speak to me now isn't acceptable. And there's going to have to be some change and we need to set some boundaries. If that's not respected, there's always going to be a stigma around that, regardless of our cultural background. But from the conversations that I've had with people, that looks very different in different cultures, depending on what your circumstances are. So, do you have a relationship personally with family?
I do, yes, I
Yeah.
do. But it's like the number one question I get in the community is, well, what if this isn't healthy for me? Or what if I don't want to be in relationship with my family or my parents anymore? And as you say, right, the circumstances are different for everyone. In so many Eastern cultures, collectivist cultures, we are taught to take care of other people at the expense of ourselves. But in a
Mm.
Western culture, in an individualistic culture, we are taught to take care of ourselves, sometimes at the expense of other people. And so, for so many of us who straddle between those cultural norms, it can be really hard to know, is it okay? Is it okay for me to step away? Is it okay for me to speak up? Is it okay for me to decide that this is no longer feels good for me? And, I think for a lot of us children of immigrants, bicultural folks, have not necessarily been taught that we are adults who can decide for ourselves whether or not we want to be in these relationships. Because in so many of our family systems, there is a hierarchy and kind of an ingrained narrative that our parents are always our parents. We are always the kid, no matter how old we are, no matter even if we have our own kids, no matter what we're doing in our own life, that they know better than us, that they are deserving of our respect, even if they're not, or they should be in the know of our life choices, or we are obligated to them, or we have some duty to them. And that's not necessarily a bad thing for some of us who have good relationships with our family. But for those of us who don't, it can feel really suffocating and imposing on us to not feel like we're allowed to do what's right for us. And so, especially with children of immigrants, there's often these different narratives that we carry about what it means to be aligned with what's expected of us versus what we want to do in our lives. And sometimes, for me, for example, I didn't always have a good relationship with my family. And it took a lot of me getting physical and emotional distance from them before I was able to come back and then try a different type of relationship with them. And I've learned the skills now after my own therapy, after my own years of healing and growth, to be able to approach my relationship with my parents differently, and it feels good to me. But I talk to people who will say, you know what, my tolerance is different than yours, and that's okay. And that's why for me, it's never black and white. It's never, this is how you shouldn't be in a relationship with someone
Mm.
anymore. I can never tell anyone that. Instead, whatever feels good to you might feel bad to me. Whatever feels bad to you might feel fine to me. We have to really explore our own tolerance and really be willing to get uncomfortable and sit in that discomfort to figure out whether or not we want to be in these relationships.
And I do think it is such an uncomfortable place to sit in when you are starting to navigate setting boundaries, when you are starting to navigate, do I want to be in this relationship? Is this relationship healthy? What can I do to change my role if I want to progress with this relationship? How can I protect myself, but also have some kind of relationship there? And I think it's really difficult for people to navigate that space. What are some of the things that you recommend to people who are perhaps recognizing now that their relationship, especially as children of immigrants, that feels like it has a lot of duty around it, that feels like it has a lot of debt mindset? What would you recommend to them if they're recognizing that these things aren't necessarily healthy and they're wanting to set some boundaries and step away, but not end the relationship fully?
It's such a hard one, right? Because in so many of our cultural systems and family systems, even setting some boundaries then means like going towards the extreme. It's received in a way that's like, you don't want a relationship with me versus I just want to change something about the relationship so it feels good to me. So, really understanding what it is that's not feeling good to you, really having language and understanding and clarity around what it is that you might need in the relationship. I think that that's the first step for so many of us because sometimes we're like, oh, this doesn't feel good, but why doesn't it feel good? Are you able, not that you need to explain it, but I think it can help you have clarity on like, okay, I actually find that this one situation in a relationship doesn't feel good, but that doesn't mean I don't want to be in the relationship. Or you might find everything about the relationship doesn't feel good, and therefore I need to make a bigger change. So
Mm.
once you can have language around why it doesn't feel good, you can start to, explore what those steps might be to change that dynamic. I think for so many people too, who come to me, oftentimes it's, why should I do this work if my parents aren't willing to do this work? What's the point of me trying to heal if other people won't try to heal in my
Mm.
family? Because, what's the point? And to that, I always say there is a point because we can't control other people, but we can learn skills. We can learn tools for how we want to show up differently in our relationships. And I think that that is so powerful because it empowers us and gives us the agency to decide how we might want to show up differently. So sometimes for some of us who where boundaries is like kind of a taboo term, where we aren't taught to be explicit and say no and verbally communicate these boundaries, we want to focus on our behavioral boundaries. We want to focus on the things that we can control. Maybe it's spending less time with family. Maybe it's not picking up the phone every day. Maybe it's when you go home, you have behaviors in place where you can remove yourself from, the family room when everyone's together and take some time for yourself, or have buffer time with friends, placed in. So like focusing more on what you can do behaviorally, how you respond to loved ones, skills and tools for being able to manage your own defensiveness, anger, frustration. Once you change and once you learn how to show up differently in a relationship, that relationship will change and be different. And you're not changing someone else, but you're changing the ways that you engage. And therefore, you feel more empowered and feel like the relationship feels different. Some people, that's not enough, and that's okay. For some people, it doesn't matter what you do, you still engage in a relationship, it feels bad. And to those people, I always say, you have to make a hard choice. The choice, and I think many of us know what those choices are, but we are not willing to make the hard choice. The choices are either stay in something that doesn't feel good and figure out how to protect yourself and take care of yourself, or actually make a change, which means having a conversation with your loved ones, removing yourself from the relationship, even if it's just temporary, right? For some of us, we just need that distance before we can return to the relationship, or cut off, strings with that relationship altogether. And I think it's really hard for us to really, for many of us who've been taught that loyalty to family is everything, that you're supposed to be in these relationships, you have to be in these relationships, you're a bad kid if you're not in these relationships. There is so much unlearning of those cultural narratives first before we can make the choice to not be in those relationships. And that's a lot of the work I do with my clients is, what have you been taught about being in family? What have you been taught about loyalty and sacrifice and what it means to be in these relationships? Because we need to explore that first before we can build up and write a new story for yourself about what it means to be in these relationships.
Wow, I think that's so impactful for people. I think that's going to have such a huge impact for so many. And when you talk about some of those cultural narratives that you are taught, what kind of things are they?
Yeah, I mean, the big one is loyalty at all costs. So keeping the peace, being in relationships, even if they don't feel good to you because they're family or their blood being thicker than water. So family being more important than your friendships or even your romantic relationships, right? Then there are gendered narratives that many of us have been taught because in a lot of Eastern family systems, there's a vertical social hierarchy, which means that so in Western family systems, what happens is like grandparents, parents, kids, they all are on the same playing field, but just generationally different. And in Eastern family systems, it's a vertical social hierarchy, which means that our roles are delineated by age, gender, birth order. So it doesn't matter that I have siblings and we're all siblings, right? What matters is that I have an older brother, an older sister, I'm the youngest, I'm a daughter. And so the roles that have been imposed on me, the expectations, the values that have been imposed on me are very different from that of my older brother because he has been taught to like kind of be the caretaker, to take care of his younger sisters, to be the one who will financially give back to my parents. I, as the youngest daughter, have been taught to be more submissive, to be more self-sacrificial. So there's gendered narratives, there's birth order narratives, there's sibling narratives, there's, all of these narratives that are imposed on us on how we are supposed to show up in our family. And that will replicate itself in the workplace. It'll replicate itself in your friend group. It'll replicate itself in what you expect out of love and romance. And so I think it's really important for us to understand those narratives because that's the only way for us to really start to interrogate, are these values true to me? What do I need for it to be different? How can I take care of myself? And some people will say, oh, I can actually do that while being in these relationships. And some people might find I actually can't be in these relationships while I do that.
Mm. And you mentioned siblings there. What impact does stepping away from these relationships that are no longer serving you or that you're finding are harming you? What impact does that have on sibling relationships in your experience?
A lot of impact. I think, depending on your family system, we are taught how to engage with our siblings based on our relationship with our parents.
Mm.
So I see people whose parents might have pitted siblings against each other, or played favorites on siblings, or, created narratives about siblings to other siblings. And then, you start to internalize that belief about that sibling. And I think once you decide to step away from a family system or your parent, you're really recalibrating all the other relationships in that family system. So even removing a connection to one family member will require a recalibration of all of the other family relationships, because family systems work the way they work because everyone is playing a role that's expected of them. And once one person decides they don't want to play that role anymore, it's going to change the entire family system. So sometimes there's resentment, sometimes there's like frustration and arguments that happen between siblings when one sibling sets a boundary and the other doesn't. Sometimes there's, acceptance, and sometimes you can build a better relationship with your siblings because you're able to talk to them or rely on them for support as you navigate the maybe estrangement or low contact that you're deciding to do with other family members. But it really varies depending on family.
Mm. Siblings is one thing that comes up quite a lot when I'm either working with clients or when I talk to people in my community. And it's something I don't have experience of because I was an only child. So for me, it looks very different. And the one thing that I hear so often is when you will have one sibling who is very much in that kind of caretaker role of the parent and then becomes kind of their warrior, almost steps up to bat and is, I'm going to defend the parent regardless of whatever you're saying making sense. And that's a really difficult place to be in when you're on the receiving end of that. And I think what I always say to people is that you can have the two same parents, but have totally different experiences of them. And I think that relates to what you were saying about how you are assigned these different roles.
Yes, absolutely. And I think it's really hard because, like, I think we can't, like you said, we all have different experiences with our parents. And so even though, I'll take me for instance, I was raised by very different parents, even though they were the same parents as my siblings.
Yeah.
I've had to have conversations with my siblings and say, what was it like for you? What was your relationship with, Pop growing up? How did you engage with him? And learn, I've had to learn more about my siblings as adults because I want to create a new relationship with them as adults outside of our family system. And so it's almost like creating a friendship again, like, making a new friend and asking all these questions and not making assumptions. Just because we were raised in the same household, just because we have the same parents, doesn't mean that we have the same narratives or experiences or understanding of our family system. And I think one of the hardest things in a family system, especially with siblings, is when one sibling sees things so differently that it creates distance between siblings, because we can't, no matter how much we might love our family, it doesn't mean that we're on the same page about how we understand our family dynamics. And I think that can be really painful for people to say, why doesn't my sister see that I'm struggling so much, or why doesn't my brother understand that, it's different for me because my parents do X, Y, and Z for him and not me. But we can't force other people to try to like interrogate those relationships the same way we want to. It's the same thing I say about any relationship, right? People are on different parts of their journey towards interrogating relationships, understanding healing, understanding their dynamics, understanding their own role in these dynamics. And you might be ready to start interrogating and understanding and asking questions, but that doesn't mean the other people around you are also willing to do that.
Yeah, absolutely. And we all kind of move at our own pace with this, don't we? And find our own path through this experience. One of the things that you mentioned earlier was about the differences between this kind of collectivist society and our culture versus this more individualist culture. I think when it comes to the more collectivist culture, I know for myself, my family unit looked very much like me and my mum. That was pretty much it. Um, there was perhaps her siblings, but very much on the periphery. We didn't really see them. I didn't know them particularly well. And I think in a collectivist culture, there's much more of a strong, broad family unit. What does it look like when you are setting those boundaries in such a large group of people for so many people?
It's so hard.
Mm.
It's so difficult for so many people because, if I take the stats I know about the US, it's that a lot of white American people live in multi-generational households more than their Western counterparts.
Mhm.
I would assume that that's probably the case in Western countries everywhere because a lot of immigrants or people will become insular in their communities, whether it's with extended family or it's with the immigrant community or the community that looks like them, whether it's religion, whether it's culture, whether it's race, we become insular. And I think, I didn't grow up with extended family. It was just my parents, my brother, my sister, and I, and all of my extended family lived abroad. And so that actually plays a different role for us where it felt like it's only us. So we have to be close. We have to maintain our relationships. And then for other people who had their extended family around, you get the other side of the coin, which is like now we have all of these different people with different narratives, with different expectations, different generations, right? You can see your parents kind of struggling with their own relationships with their parents, who are your grandparents. And, everyone's dynamics are impacting everyone. But again, because you might live in the same household or you might have these narratives of family is everything, we have to respect our elders, we can't speak up, it's disrespectful, you might struggle to set those boundaries. And the thing about boundaries in collectivist cultures is that it's not just for you, right? When you set a boundary in a collectivist culture, you are impacting all of these other relationships. So, for instance, if someone wanted to set a boundary with a grandparent, you are then impacting the relationship that your parent has with that parent because now that grandparent might be turning to that parent and saying, look what you did, you raised your kid this way. And so like it has ripple effects. I like to say that healing has ripple effects, but so does setting boundaries, so does conflict, so does tension. And so when we think about it, there's almost more at stake. That feels like there's more at stake. Not that it always feels high stakes for all of us who are trying to decide if we want to be in relationships with family. But I think it's even more so for those in collectivist cultures because it's almost like you internalize this belief that you are bad, that you are disrespectful, that you are betraying your family. And so I think those multi-generational narratives can be really difficult and just add more complications to people who are trying to figure out whether or not they want to be in relationships with family.
Absolutely agree. I think it sounds so much more challenging to have to navigate so many different relationships all coming at you at once, so many different expectations of how you would behave. And yes, there's always still that stigma around it. Yes, it's always still really, really difficult. Of course it is. And I don't think anyone can ever detract from that. But when you have a family unit where, like you said, for you guys, it felt very much like you had to be close because you were all you had. And then on the other side of the coin, everybody's relationships are impacting everybody. And this will be across the board, I'm sure, where some families have big, big families, and some families are like me, where it's just kind of almost one to one. Every different unit will have its own challenges. But it's interesting as you talk about those multi-generational households where your relationship with, say, grandparent or aunt or uncle will impact the relationship that you have with your parent as well. Can you talk a little bit more about that for me?
Yeah, I hear stories all the time from people saying, like, I don't feel comfortable around so and so, let's say an uncle,
Mhm.
and I don't know how to set a boundary there because it's important to my mom to be close to her brother. And if I set that boundary, then that family is going to take it out on the entire family rather than just me and my uncle being able to hash that out ourselves. So it's almost like families are a unit versus like the individual and the families get to make
Mhm.
decisions. And I think that's the biggest cultural barrier for so many people is that we are not just an individual, we are a part of a family unit. So when we decide to make decisions, it impacts everyone in that family unit.
Mm. That's really interesting. And you'd mentioned before how you've kind of grown up in this US culture that's quite individual. It's very individualistic, it's very much you for you. And then you've also got the cultural norms in your home that are completely at odds with each other. And I can imagine, and correct me if I'm wrong, that so much of you being here and having that individualistic culture around you is blamed as opposed to some accountability there. And, well, maybe we could have done things differently. Perhaps I don't speak to you how I should, or perhaps I don't treat you how I should. Maybe my expectations need to change.
Oh,
What?
yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. I mean, that is spot on because that my whole first chapter of my book is about that idea that like culture sometimes becomes a scapegoat. you
Mm.
know, especially in a Western world. For me, my mom used to, you know, still will throw American at me like a bad word, like you're so American. Or maybe
Mm.
there's just a cultural difference here. If I try to speak up, or if I try to challenge something, or if I try to ask questions like, why is it this way? Doesn't that hurt you? You know, when I try to interrogate, she's will often, you know, just say, well, I think it's a cultural difference. I don't think you understand culturally. And for me, like you said, that can sometimes make me feel like, well, she's not taking accountability. Instead, we're just blaming culture, like this whole big thing on culture, rather than actually examining, well, what about the people in this culture? You know, who has power here, who doesn't, who's hurt because of this, at what cost are we maintaining certain relationships? How is it actually impacting people? But I think the thing there is that there's also a difference in emotional maturity that happens, especially for children of immigrants who might have, or children of refugees who might have parents and ancestors who've experienced so much pain and harm and war and, you know, all of these things, poverty, like colonization, all of these things, that they were always in survival mode, that they didn't actually have access to and weren't taught by their own parents to develop emotionally, to actually think about their feelings, think about what feels good. Instead, everyone was just playing a role that's expected of them or just trying to survive. And so the survival mindset stops people from being able to really examine, does this feel good? Should I still do this? How am I hurting people? And it almost becomes a scapegoat for that accountability. And so what happens for children of immigrants is that we are passed down these narratives, but now we have access to resources. I had access to therapy, to knowledge, to, you know, content that my parents didn't have access to when they were growing up. And so I then have surpassed them in being able to understand emotionally, but that means that it creates a little tension for us because they don't totally get it. And we will have to have these sometimes painful and hard conversations about it. And sometimes the default for them is just, it's cultural. And I have to either accept that that's as far as they're willing to go, or decide, how am I going to show up differently and change this relationship so it feels good to me.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting, the term of culture being a scapegoat, because so many of us have been in the position of being the scapegoat, of being the one who's always blamed. To see it passed off on culture, in a way, it doesn't make it feel any better. It doesn't make it feel any less. It becomes that frustration because how do you go up against that of it's
Mhm.
not culture, this is not acceptable in any culture.
Yeah, I mean, it's super painful. And that's why I think at the end of the day, a lot of the work I do is building up a tolerance for discomfort. Because no matter how you decide to show up in your relationships, even if you just choose to maintain them, but if you want to change one thing about it, it's going to be uncomfortable. If you
Mm.
choose to have a hard conversation with your loved ones, it's going to be uncomfortable. If you choose to go no contact, it's going to be uncomfortable. So we have to be comfortable with that discomfort, because no matter what you choose, no matter what you're up against, it doesn't always feel great. And some people avoid that feeling by just reverting to the behaviors and relationships that actually aren't healthy for them. So instead, my work is always like, we can build up your tolerance for discomfort, and then you can make the hard choice. Stay in it, don't stay in it, have the hard conversation, whatever it is, like you just kind of choose your hard.
Mm. Choosing your hard summarizes it, doesn't it? It really
Yeah.
does. You
Yeah.
mentioned that cultural scapegoating is kind of the first sort of chapter of your book. You talk a little bit about that. Tell me a little bit more about your book, because I'm really excited for this book to come out.
Yes, so it comes out June 6th in the UK, which is this week, which is really
Mm.
exciting. So, um, my book is part memoir, part self-help. So it shares my story as a daughter of immigrants, granddaughter of refugees, you know, being the first to be born in the West, all of these experiences around and expectations around academic success, even though I failed, or, you know, mental health and not rocking the boat, even though I struggled, you know, going to therapy, all of these things that I have experienced, but also that led to a lot of shame for me because I felt like I wasn't doing right by my parents, or I let down my parents in some way, or I wasn't enough in some way. And so the book will take you on the journey of my life, but it also incorporates all of the tools and expertise I have as a therapist. So how do we actually straddle multiple cultures? How do we challenge the way we think about wellness? So it's not just for children of immigrants, but it's really for anyone who wants to think about wellness from a new perspective. And so in the Western world, we're often taught there's one way to set boundaries. There's one way to be in relationships. This is what normal looks like. This is what healthy looks like. This is what happy looks like. But for many of us, no matter where you come from, it looks different. The ways we want to be in our relationships might look different from the people that we, our friends, or what we're taught in the, mainstream wellness conversations. So my book is all about kind of challenging your assumptions, and by your, I mean the reader's assumptions about wellness and what it means to be well, and to provide more ways to think about what it means to be in healthy relationships, what it means to be authentic, what it means to stay true to yourself, what it means to challenge culture and these narratives that we've learned, whether it's the Western narratives or the Eastern narratives. And so, the book is divided into chapters by my story, but also by concepts and themes, so that I can explore that as a therapist. And every interstitial chapter between the big chapter has tons of reflection questions, journal prompts, exercises on those themes I talk about. So it's kind of part workbook, part memoir, part self-help. 400 and something pages, but super
Wow.
exciting. Yeah.
That's amazing. That's such an achievement as well, to not only have that book out there, but to be able to help so many people in the way that you do. Because as you say, it is something that is quite shrouded in shame. That's how I always think of it, is really kind of, it's like someone's dipped it in shame and then shook it off and dipped it again. It's a really taboo topic that not many people talk about, and challenging what healthy looks like as well, because for everybody, healthy will look different. And
Mhm.
what your tolerance level is might not be for other people. And I have people that I work with all the time as a coach and say to them, I'm never going to sit here and encourage you to cut contact with someone, because that's not my place. And that might not be the answer for you. And that's okay. It might be the answer for you, and I can help you work through that. And that's also okay. But for
Mhm.
so many people, a low contact relationship might work. A placing of boundaries, as hard as that might feel, is enough for them to be able to say, okay, no, I'm going to challenge this, or I'm going to place boundaries with myself, perhaps, of
Mhm.
not answering the phone, as you said before, or having a little bit less contact. Those things can make such a big difference. So,
Yes, yeah. I mean, I love the way that you summarized all of that, because it's so true. I tell people all the time that my book and my work, it's meant to leave you with more questions than answers, because the goal is for you to then take those questions into your own life and decide for yourself what are the answers to these questions.
and I think, as somebody who's grown up in that kind of dysfunctional family unit, for me, that respecting of autonomy and saying, you can go away and reflect on this and work out what works for you, that's a big thing, because that's something that I didn't have growing up. And I can imagine is very much the same in your experience.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I think that's the biggest thing with my work, is that people come to me and say, "Oh, I feel like I have agency to make some choices for myself." And so many of us may not have been taught that in our dysfunctional family or in our family dynamics.
And it's such a powerful thing to be able to do that. Can you let people know where they can find you, where they can find the book?
Yes, yeah. So all the information about everything I do is on my website, which is www.sahajkohli.com. You can find information about my book. You can find information about events I'm doing, including in London next week. You can find all of the offerings I have, my newsletter, my Instagram page, my community resources, my speaking offerings, all of the things on my website. Otherwise, you can find me on Instagram at Brown Girl Therapy. And yeah, all of that is just available through those links.
Amazing. And I'll make sure that I drop the links in the bio as well as a link for getting hold of that book. Don't worry, guys, I have got you. So thank you so much, Sahaj. Thank you. It's been wonderful to talk to you.
It was so nice to be here and talk to you too. Thank you so much for your work, and yeah, for this podcast.
Well, thank you for giving me your time, and I will speak to you guys again soon, and I will hopefully speak to you soon as well.
Take
Take
care.
care. Bye.